Copyright 2009, University of Auckland, all rights reserved.
Hi, hello everybody. Welcome to this debate. The existence of God, the four questions, burden of proof, cosmology, morality, and revelation. Hi, my name's Patrick. I'm a former student here, and I'll be the moderator for this debate. There's two teams. So we've got the Theist team here, run by Zach, and the Atheist team here, run by Josh. The format of the debate is that each side is going to introduce their positions and address the burden of proof first. And they'll have 10 minutes each to do that, and that will be the Theist will be starting that section of the debate, followed by Cosmology. That will be 5 minutes each, starting again with the Theists. Morality, starting again with the Theists, 5 minutes, and Revelation, starting with the Atheists. This was a coin toss, by the way. After that, there'll be a 5-minute loo break, and we'll have some question time. And after that, finally, there'll be some pizza, which I'm sure some of you are here for that. And that's, thank you very much to the Evangelical Union for that. By the way, this event has been run by the RSS and the Evangelical Union. Right, so in terms of how I'm going to police the time, I've got a bell here, so 30 seconds before the end of the time, I'll do a single bell, and when their time is up, and then they'll have about 30 seconds to wrap up. And if they're still going, I'll get the big bell. So, without further ado, we will launch straight into the debate with Zach addressing the burden of proof and setting up their position. Cool.
Well, hello everyone, and thanks heaps for attending today. I hope you'll really listen carefully to what we've all got to say. Thanks especially to Josh for really driving this event. I'm convinced that this kind of dialogue is very much in the interests of students and and the university as a whole. So it's great that you all agree, and it's great that Josh has driven this. So I'm very pleased as a former president of the club to represent the Evangelical Union, which is a student-run organisation which aims to encourage Christian faith on campus. The club has been here at Auckland Uni since at least the 1930s, and we're not planning on leaving anytime soon. I'm a postgrad student in biology, and my undergrad science degree was conjoint with an arts degree in philosophy and economics. Joining me representing the Evangelical Union is Stuart McEwing, who is currently studying his master's degree in theology and has 3 undergraduate degrees. Jake Stowers, who's studied theology here at Auckland Uni and who was president of the Christian group REAL last year, and Tim Conda, who is finishing conjoint degrees in physics and law. So I'll be speaking on the burden of proof, Stuart on the cosmological arguments, Jake on ethics, and Tim on God's revelation or presentation of himself to us in Jesus of Nazareth. Okay, so on to the topic, the burden of proof. First note, if there is no God and nothing like God, then this debate, I think, doesn't really matter. Indeed, it's hard to see how anything matters in such a world, a naturalistic world, a world where there is no God and nothing like God. But we will argue that our world is not a naturalistic world, and as such, this debate does matter. So unless we're certain that God does exist, I think we should be willing to take this debate seriously. But what kind of God are we talking about? I think a good starting point is given by Martin Novak, director of the program for evolutionary dynamics at Harvard. And so he says, God is the ultimate cause of all that exists. God is that without which there would be no evolution at all. God is creator and sustainer of the universe and the originator of everything. So who bears the burden of proof in this dialogue? In other words, will it be legitimate for one team to sit back and simply ask why incessantly? Or do we both have a case to make? Can we sit back and just be skeptical, or do we both have a positive case to bring forward? Now, of course, I think it's the latter. I think we both have a case to make. The Christians will argue that you should believe that God exists. And the task of the atheist team will be to argue that you should not, and that the world consequently has a rather different metaphysical structure. Now, it may be suggested that atheism is merely absence of belief. Indeed, if you've been on the internet before, you may have come across this being rather aggressively asserted. Atheism is just a lack of belief, you don't need to defend it. It's amazing how passionate some atheists can be about their belief in nothing. But, putting this aside, this would be a non-standard definition. In the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article, which I've just clipped there, the noted Australian atheist philosopher Jack Smart says in his article on atheism and agnosticism, atheism means the negation of theism, the denial of the existence of God. And of course there are many such examples. This is the standard definition in the field which looks at whether atheism or theism is true, a philosophy of religion. Now, complete absence of belief is what you find in the uninformed and those without the requisite cognitive equipment. For instance, young children. They may have complete absence of belief because they haven't thought about the topic. But atheism as lack of belief is inadequate to distinguish positions in this kind of informed discussion. And atheism as negation seems the more accurate account. But on to the real question, which is the default position? Now, I'm not sure exactly what position today's atheists' spokespeople will take on this, but here are 5 reasons which I present to you to doubt that atheism is the clear default position. So, number 1, firstly, let's accept that the claim that God exists is a positive claim. Now, regardless of what we take atheism to mean, not all positive claims have a heavy burden of proof associated with them. Consider, for instance, belief in the external world, the idea that the external world, the world around us, actually exists. That's a positive claim, but we don't require a lot of evidence for it. Or the idea that we should believe in other minds. It's very hard to prove empirically, but we still tend to accept it. Sometimes a positive claim is the appropriate default, given our background knowledge. Now, if we take atheism to deny or render implausible the existence of all gods and similar supernatural agents, then it is quite a large claim about the nature of the universe, and it's unclear why it should escape the task of having to justify itself positively. So that's the first reason. Secondly, God is not a typical entity, not just an object in the world. One example of this is to consider the consequences of there being no God, compared, say, with the consequences of there being any other object you can think about in the world. Bertrand Russell talks about a teapot orbiting Mars. Now, if that didn't exist, there wouldn't be many other consequences. But the absence of God would imply a number of other things, such as that there is no single explanation which draws together the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the existence of moral beliefs in humans. But that's what God does. It's this kind of meta-explanation that draws together a number of things. A godless universe has a very different metaphysical structure than a theistic one. The absence of God also makes the existence of a range of other things highly unlikely, including immortal souls or immaterial souls, moral facts, and a purpose for the universe. Each of these would be unlikely to exist if God did exist. Okay, so that was the second reason. God's not just another entity. The third reason to think that the burden of proof is not just on the theists is the claim that God exists involves the suggestion that there is a more fundamental, personal level of reality than what we see around us in the physical world. Atheists and theists generally agree about matters in the physical world, but we disagree over whether there is an ultimate personal explanation. Now, I think there's no obvious default in this situation. The question isn't even just, is there an additional supernatural level of reality? But, does the physical world require a non-physical agent-type explanation? It's not obvious that we can just rule out that possibility from the start. Okay, that was the third. Now the fourth. Belief in God is typical across human cultures. It is the status quo. Atheism is an outlier. culturally. This doesn't guarantee that it's false, but it is one reason to suspect that the atheist will have some work to do in convincing most people concerning the truth of their worldview. The fifth and final reason is that we don't live in an empty world, a blank nothingness, but instead we live in one with many particular features which call out for some kind of explanation. Now, our team will argue that some of these features strongly suggest the existence of God. So those are 5 reasons to think that theism is not the only position with a burden of proof. And I think, so that will be enough for my introduction. I look forward to hearing the case for atheism and contrasting it with the case for Christian theism in discussion with you all as we consider together these questions that matter.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight to debate something that's been debated for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, yet we're no closer to actually coming up with an answer, which I think says quite a lot about the subject matter in hand. Alright, so first of all, a couple of disclaimers and that sort of thing. The RSS, we're not actually an atheist organisation. Zach's actually our secretary. Where you can see from our mission statement here, there's nothing about promoting atheism or any other worldview, no matter how uncontroversial and well supported it may be. So why are we doing this? Well, there's no atheist association on campus, but there is like 10 or 20 Christian associations. So who else is going to? And it's a claim, so why not? But we want to make it clear that we're not actually here representing the consensus view even of the RSS. We don't have one, although there are quite a few atheists and agnostics in the group, and theists as well. With me tonight, I've got 3 other atheists. We've got Blake, who's handling cosmology, Alex, who'll be doing morality, and Kieran, who will be doing revelation. And you can see a little bit about all of us up there and what we're about and some information. But all of us, we like to point out, used to believe in gods. I lost my faith when I was about 5, but some of them, and quite recently, were quite religious, like 19 or so. So we want to make it clear that the assertion that was made last year by a previous student who's no longer at the university, that atheists think theists are somehow inferior, is wrong. This isn't true. There's some incredibly smart theists that dwarf my intelligence, so there's no way that I'd look down on anyone for believing it. They often do this, though, have these beliefs for reasons other than truth. They're in terms of the comfort that it gives, the family that they've been born into, their group of friends, the society, and giving up these beliefs will come at a cost, even if it is just causing some people you care very deeply about a lot of emotional distress when they think you're going to burn in hell. We can look around the universe and say, well, is this consistent with there being no supernatural force? And if you do that, there are 6 things that, yes, quite clearly it is. However, nothing about these 6 things actually demonstrates that there is no God. There's nothing to stop a God from creating a universe like this. So that's not going to actually get us anywhere. So what actually is atheism? Well, Jack managed to hit it right on one of them. It's the position statement on theistic claims. It is the rejection of these theistic claims because they have failed to meet their burden of proof. The arguments and evidence presented thus far suffer from fallacious reasoning, either through to a combination of logical fallacies or lack of evidence in their premises, through to objectively false claims in some cases, to non sequitur conclusions that don't follow. Now, there's often a high level of sophistication and definitely a lot of passion in the pleading of these arguments, but none of this overcomes those objections. Therefore, these truth claims are rejected. Sort of like if you're ever called up for jury service in a criminal case, you're asked to decide between the defendant being guilty and not guilty. You're not asked to decide between the defendant being guilty and innocent. You may suspect that they are, but the burden of proof is on the side of the prosecution who's making the claim that the person did the crime. Similarly, we find God not guilty of existing. Some of us suspect that he's innocent of his existing, but that's really a different kettle of fish. And the reason why we have this statement, this position, is for 2 main points. Now, one of them, it's very difficult to impossible to prove a negative. And rejecting God is a negative position. And the second one is that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, when I brought this up last year, Jake pointed out that you can prove a negative, things like logical contradictions, square circles. And we are pretty confident that there's no T-Rexes anywhere on the Earth because we see them. Absence of evidence. Yes and no to both of those. First of all, not everything that doesn't exist, like T-Rexes on Earth, has a logical contradiction associated with it. That's not necessary. Just because you can't find a logical contradiction about God doesn't mean that he is suddenly more likely, or it's suddenly more likely. Now, there are some God concepts that do have logical contradictions, and as soon as you knock one of those down, it goes, well, that's not the God I believe in. We're not going to make any progress on that front. The other thing is absence of evidence isn't always proof of absence. Now, there's this fish that was alive 65 million years ago called the lobefin fish, coelacanth, went extinct, couldn't find it anywhere in the fossil record. It's sort of like the T-Rex, except for about 100 years ago they started fishing it up between Madagascar and Africa. The burden of proof is on the people who think that fish is still around to actually produce one. Similarly, people who think that T-Rexes exist, and there are a few people out there who claim that they've seen them, are claiming they're in the middle of nowhere where no one sees them very often. Now, are we to assume that the burden of proof is equal upon us going, there's no T-Rex, to them? Now, you have to be omnipresent and omnipotent in the bounds of the thing you're talking about to say lack of evidence is proof that it doesn't exist. I don't think there's a T-Rex in here because we'd see it if it's a 6 metre long lizard. Now, if it's incorporeal and invisible, suddenly the rules change a bit. And that's what the God is. It's an incorporeal critter, or entity. Now, if we find evidence for God, then we've disproven the hypothesis that God does not exist, and we've proven supernatural. Woo! Now, if it's absent, that's not proof, because it's indistinguishable from one that hasn't revealed itself yet, or in enough to meet the burden of proof, or just deliberately testing us, or hiding, or whatever else, and that's indistinguishable from one that doesn't exist at all. Hence why the burden of proof is on the person making that positive claim. Well, we do have a burden, though, to look at the claims that are made and going, well, that's not quite right, but we don't have to prove non-existence. That's not the way it works. You can make an inductive argument, however, from the fact that supernatural claims to date, when they're put underneath the microscope, have all failed consistently, and the ones that have been disproven keep rising. But that doesn't mean there's not one around the corner waiting to prove itself. You can't say that there is no God. Essentially, the way it works is like this. Atheists, the majority of atheists that you ever meet are actually agnostic atheists. We don't think God exists, but don't think you can prove a negative, and we're in that category there. And what my opponent has tried to do is drag us down into the Gnostic atheist category and say, that's naturalism, prove that. That's not the way it works. That's strawmanning our position. And also, Patrick, our moderator, is in the claim that everything doesn't exist. Sometimes I want to strangle him. He doesn't think you can know anything, but that's why I picked him. The extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence. Now, I could make a claim to you that in around 2011 December, I went down to Wellington and I had a fling with a girl. And I'd hope that most of you would probably think that I'm not that unlovable that that could possibly happen. I could produce receipts to show that I was there. I could probably even produce you a photo. That's all evidence for that claim, and you probably choose to accept it. Now, when I show you a photo of her, you'll go, haha, way too pretty for you. But maybe she has a thing for hairy old guys. We don't know. When you realise that it's actually Miranda Kerr, Victoria's Secret supermodel, you might be inclined to cry bullshit. And you'd probably be right. But what about all that evidence I produced it? Well, that's not enough to establish this claim because it's an extraordinary claim. It's bigger than that. And even if you could get her to say, no, I didn't touch that guy with a 10-foot barge pole, I could just turn around and say, well, she doesn't want to make Orlando jealous and ruin their marriage. I can just explain away that objection. It's clearly on me. I'm clearly going to have to provide some pretty compelling evidence to prove that. Now ask yourself the question, is the claim that there's an entity, a supernatural, all-powerful entity that made the entire universe just so he can have a personal relationship with you and is not blatantly obvious to everybody, an extraordinary claim? I think it is. Is it an extraordinary claim that you happen to be born into the one religion that's right? That is. And you see religions across the world. Now that doesn't mean one of them can't be right, but you're going to have to provide some pretty powerful evidence. So tonight, even if Blake manages to explain all of cosmology and so you don't need a God, and everyone's convinced about that, and morality manages to be knocked out of the park by Alex, and Karen shows that every single Christian concept, and there's 40,000 competing ones, that they're all wrong along with all the other religions, that doesn't mean that there's not a supernatural entity that we're yet to find out hanging around. We cannot disprove a negative. That's why the burden of proof is upon them. don't let them off. In fact, don't let anyone off, because it's very easy to make a lot of assertions and then walk away, especially in this sort of debate. So hold both sides of feet to their fire. Ask them, have they really proven what they're trying to say? And you can come and talk to any of us outside of the thing. Don't evangelize. I got kicked out of the Alpha course when I was 25. You don't have a chance, all right? But I can explain to you why I think these things that I do. And yeah, how much time have we left? 40 seconds. Okay, on to the things that Zach said. I don't think the actual world that we see around it being self-evident doesn't meet a burden of proof. You experience it every day. That's a burden of proof. You prove it by seeing it and experiencing it. So that's not correct. As for other people's minds, Coco the gorilla actually has a theory of mind, because she tried to convince her trainer that her kitten was the one that ripped it out of the wall. She understands that the trainer doesn't know everything that she knows. However, she doesn't realize that a kitten ripping a sink out of the wall is a very unbelievable thing. I'd have to agree with them with the other two, but that doesn't mean that we have to prove that there is no God. And there are many beliefs that are universal, including human sacrifice. Now, do we have to have a burden of proof to say that's wrong? Thank you.
Well, good evening, and thank you for coming and giving me the opportunity to speak. Today I'm going to give you some evidence to show that it's more reasonable to believe that God exists than it is to believe that there is no God. And this piece of evidence comes in the form of a philosophical argument from the principle of sufficient reason. This principle is that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. There is on TV at the moment a program called Under the Dome. On it, a translucent dome appears over a small town, causing lots of chaos and trapping everyone inside. The great mystery of the show is trying to discover the explanation for its existence. Now, if you were a character in this town and someone were to say to you that there was no explanation, you would think that the dome's explanation was still a mystery to that person. But you wouldn't think that there was literally no explanation. Such is the nature of reality. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. It also wouldn't matter if you were to decrease the size of this dome to a house, or a mouse, or increase the size to a continent, or a galaxy. Changing the size of the dome wouldn't eliminate the need for an explanation of that dome, even if it were coextensive with the universe. So the universe itself isn't an exemption to the rule that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. It would be arbitrary otherwise, and it would commit the taxicab fallacy. Just like a patron who flees the taxicab at his destination when it comes time to pay the fare, so is the person who dismisses the principle when it comes time to explain the universe. The atheist might at this point object by saying that if everything has an explanation, God must have an explanation for its existence. Well, I would agree. Even God has an explanation for his existence. But let's not misunderstand what Leibniz understood as requiring an explanation. For him, there were two types of things that required explanations. The first were contingent beings. These are things that can fail to exist. Things like people and tables and chairs and trees and galaxies. For these things, the explanation for their existence is found outside of themselves, in an external cause. The second are necessary beings. These are things whose explanation for their existence is found within themselves. They exist by a necessity of their own nature. Just like it's necessary for a square to have 4 equal sides, it's necessary for God that he cannot fail to exist. That is, if God exists, he is a necessary being, and the explanation for his existence is that it is in his very nature to exist. We can accordingly clarify our first premise by saying that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence, either by the necessity of its own nature or by an external cause. Now, typically, the atheist has asserted at this point that the universe has no explanation for its existence. Here, I also want to agree with the atheist that in the absence of God, the universe has no explanation. This is logically equivalent to the statement that, and 2, if the universe has an explanation for its existence, then that explanation is God. And this is wholly plausible by itself. For the universe is all of space-time reality, all matter and energy. The cause of the universe must therefore transcend the universe and be non-physical and immaterial. Moreover, this being must also be personal, for the only things that fit that description are immaterial minds or abstract objects like numbers or propositions. But abstract objects do not stand in causal relations. They don't cause anything. So the explanation of the universe must be a personal, transcendent mind, and that is what believers has always understood God to be. All that remains to say is that the universe exists, and so if you accept these three premises as more likely true than not, then you're rationally obliged to believe that from 1 and 3, the universe has an explanation of its existence, and from 2 and 4, the explanation for the existence of the universe is God. But in that case, it's true that the most reasonable thing to believe is that God exists, and that would be extraordinary, that God doesn't exist. Thank you.
Okie dokie. When we look at the universe, we see things that defy our intuitions and defy our expectations. While it's in human nature to demand an explanation for why things happen, we don't get to place demands on the universe. How we want the universe to work is completely irrelevant to what the universe actually does. We have to follow the data, we have to follow our observations and see where they lead us. So, the universe is claimed to have had a beginning, and as such it needed a cause for that beginning, a so-called uncaused cause, i.e. God. Maybe not. Not everything that exists need have a cause for its existence. To take one example from quantum mechanics, think about a radioactive atom. A radioactive atom will decay over time and emit radiation. There is no reason or cause for an atom to decay at one time and not at another. This is because quantum mechanics is inherently probabilistic in nature and not deterministic. Quantum mechanics needs to be taken into account when we look at the early universe. Right, so Einstein's theory of general relativity is often used to show how the universe was once bound up in an infinitesimal point called a singularity, which is a boundary in space-time past which you can no longer go. And therefore there will be no before the Big Bang, as it were, and this is where God somehow slips into the picture. General relativity, however, is not a final theory of the universe, nor is it a quantum theory, and so it's inappropriate for us to use in order to draw conclusions about what was happening around the time of the Big Bang. The Big Bang may simply be a point in the history of our universe. As to why there was a Big Bang in the first place, well, one plausible explanation is that it was the result of a well-established process called quantum tunneling, where our universe tunneled from another universe. The inflationary Big Bang model, as shown on the slide there, and phases of string theory predict a phenomenon called eternal inflation, whereby an infinite multiverse will be produced. It's perfectly plausible that it is, and so what need then do we have for a created God? These are consistent, self-contained and plausible models, and it's not necessary to invoke God in order to explain the existence of our universe. It's not necessary that we fall on our swords and say that we need some outside supernatural help. One can't simply brush this data aside and say, well, God did it. To do so would be cherry-picking from the laws of physics, and at the end of the day, it's ultimately intellectually dishonest. It's claimed that the universe is designed and fine-tuned for life. Firstly, our universe is very old. Our Earth shows up about 9 billion years after the Big Bang, and it's still over 4 billion years before we show up. It's an incredible waste of time. The universe is also very large. These fuzzy blobs you can see here, this is a picture taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. They're not stars, they're galaxies, and some of them are over 40 billion light years away. So I think Neil sums it up pretty well there. It's so astronomically far away it's hard to comprehend. And this is just the observable universe. One wonders why the universe is so big if it was designed just for us. And it also begs the question, how many of these galaxies contain intelligent life? How many of them are like us? Are they aware of Christianity? And was the universe also designed with them in mind? Because it also begs a more alarming question, how many of them are now extinct? Because the universe is a very hostile place. 99% of the universe is either stuff you can't see, like dark matter, or ever-expanding space. You will die instantly in 99% of the universe. Our sun has a finite lifetime, and over the course of a few billion years, due to its expansion, life on Earth will cease to exist. As shown on the slide, we're also on a collision course with the Andromeda Galaxy, and none of this shows that there is a benevolent, all-loving God who's designed this hostile universe just for us. It seems most implausible. Despite this, however, the universe still invokes awe and wonder. Our intellectual honesty and our drive to ascertain the truth continue to give us an understanding of how the universe works. These are not based on authority, as religion would have it. So I think if heaven does exist, we've all just got to do a Carl Sagan, run out and buy a telescope and just look up. Thanks.
Can we be good without God? Now, even merely to pose the question would provoke indignation from most people. And while certainly as a Christian, God has been a source of moral strength and direction, it would be supremely arrogant, not to mention ignorant, to claim that people who don't believe in God cannot live moral lives. I have atheist friends who are very moral and altruistic people. In fact, in some cases will put me to shame morally. But the question I posed was not, must we believe in God to be good? Rather, the question I posed was, can we be good without God? And here I'm going to argue, if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. And when I say objective moral values, I mean values that are binding, valid, and true, independent of whether anybody believes them or not. So by objective moral values, I mean values that are binding, true, and valid, independent of whether anybody believes them or not. For example, to say the Holocaust was objectively wrong is to say that it's wrong even though the Nazis who carried it out thought it was good. And it would still be wrong even if the Nazis went on to win World War II and successfully brainwashed and wiped out everybody who disagreed with them, so everybody thought the Holocaust would be good. Now here I'm going to argue, if God does not exist, then moral values aren't objective in that sense. And many theists as well as atheist philosophers would be in agreement on that point. The noted American philosopher of science, Michael Roos, notes, the position of the modern evolutionists is that humans have an awareness of morality, because this awareness is a biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no more than our hands or feet. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims of an objective something, ethics are an illusion. I appreciate that when someone says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think that they are appealing above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such a reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is an illusion. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great atheist philosopher who proclaimed the death of God, poured scorn, intellectual scorn on people who insisted that God does not exist, but still clung to the notion of an objective ethic. Nietzsche understood that the death of God entailed the destruction of all moral value and worth in life. Richard Dawkins' assessment of humanity's plight may be a bleak and depressing one, but why would Dawkins be wrong on atheism when he says, at bottom there is no design, no good, no evil, nothing but pitiless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. Now again, I want to emphasize what I'm claiming here. The question is not, must I believe in God to be good? As I said by way of introduction, I don't believe that for a second. Nor is the question, can we recognize moral values without belief in God? I certainly believe you can. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values exist? And like Professor Roos, I just don't see any reason to think that the morality developed by Homo sapiens in the absence of God would be objective. On atheism, human beings are just the accidental products of blind, naturalistic processes. Hunks of primordial slime evolved to a higher order, or as Bertrand Russell put it, an accidental collocation of atoms. From the goo, through the zoo, to you, to put it crudely. We are just relatively advanced primates who find themselves on this insignificant, infinitesimal speck of dust that we call planet Earth, lost somewhere in a moralless, mindless, hostile universe, doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short span of time. On atheism, actions like rape, for example, may not be socially advantageous, or may contradict the herd morality developed by Homo sapiens, or in the course of human development may now be deemed to be taboo. But you see, that does nothing in establishing that rape is morally wrong, because on atheism there really isn't anything wrong with you raping someone. There is no transcendent moral anchor or supreme good to derive notions of good and justice from. There is no absolute standard that imposes itself on your conscience. But you see, the problem is objective moral values do exist, and down deep, if you're being sincere, you know it. And there's no more reason to deny the reality of objective moral values than there is to deny the reality of the physical world. Actions like rape, child abuse, torture, gay bashing, religious persecution, these aren't just socially unacceptable behaviors, they are moral abominations. Some things are really wrong, objectively wrong. But by the same token, some things, virtues are really good, like love, self-sacrifice, compassion, generosity, equality. Some things are really good, objectively good. Thus we could summarize the argument as follows. Premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values do exist, from therefore it follows that God exists. If you do believe that moral values are objective, then you should believe in God. Thank you very much.
All right. Hello, everyone. So, I want to talk about objective morality and subjective morality, but before we get going, I have learned from previous experience, and I would like to lay out some working definitions to avoid confusion and rage quits. So, from the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary, morality and objective are defined thusly. Morality is a set of beliefs about what is right behavior and what is wrong behavior, and objective means that it is based on facts rather than feelings or opinions and exists outside of the mind. This is not so different than my teammate over here already said. So subjective then relates to the way a person experiences things in his or her own mind and is based on feelings or opinions rather than facts. So, objective morality would be morality or a code of behavior that can be defined as inherently good or inherently bad and is independent of our feelings toward it. Therefore, any appeal to adverse feeling one may have toward a particular behavior, even one that we in this room may consider extreme like rape or murder, is still an appeal to one's feelings, which are by definition subjective. Let's take, for example, a commonly accepted factoid. Everyone would agree that killing is wrong, or everyone would agree that the Holocaust was bad. Again, this is an appeal to an emotional response, an appeal to feelings. Our instinctive reactions would be to agree, but not everyone's instinctive reactions are unfalteringly in congruence. Humankind has a long history of treating each other like crap, depriving of others of freedom, goods, property, and even rights as fundamental as life. Murder, rape, slavery, racism, and war. In this society, in this particular era, the mention of any of these things tends to elicit a feeling of distaste to absolute horror. But this was not always the case, even for Western civilization, nor is it the case worldwide even today. Furthermore, this list contains current, hotly debated, and more controversial items. The point being that we don't all agree, and we've been changing our minds throughout history. What we consider good and evil changes with the needs of our societies and with an increased understanding assisted by science and technology and the comforts and luxuries science and technology bring to the quality of our daily lives. The next argument posited is usually that there is objective morality, and the fact that we disagree and change our minds about what we consider moral or immoral is just the result of some of us being wrong. First of all, there still needs to be substantial evidence provided, empirical or logical, to support the premise of objective morality. That's the first thing. Secondly, if that were the case, then who gets to decide? If your answer is God, then we're just back to the burden of proof argument. Our side and many others remain unconvinced that God exists in the first place, let alone that God is the moral authority figure. Furthermore, divine command is awfully difficult to interpret when we're not being explicitly told what is and what is not moral. Christianity itself is divided into many groups of followers who argue, for example, whether or not homosexuality is immoral, whether we should allow abortions, and so on. Clearly, subjective feelings toward morality are employed even within this one particular religion. So what do? Literally interpret the Bible? Most Christians cherry-pick passages that sound nice, like love your neighbor, and ignore the not-so-nice ones, like this one from Leviticus, where God tells us if we disobey him, he'll force us to cannibalize our children. It has been stated previously that bad things happen with what we humans perceive as no good reason because we cannot know the mind of God. If that is the case, then besides the fact that there has not been sufficient evidence provided to support objective morality, we also have no choice but to employ subjective morality. So let's talk subjective morality. In the same way that there are many ideas among Christians of what constitutes moral and immoral behavior, there's also no such thing as an all-encompassing atheist morality. I do want to point out here that we do not define our morals by naturalism or by evolutionary theory, or at least the majority of us don't. We mostly draw upon an empathy for fellow human beings, what many of us refer to as humanism, which is why there is shock value applied to the idea of killing or raping someone. Also, the fact that we are social beings and require each other's cooperation and a general societal harmony in which to function and make progress. Yes, it is sometimes hard to draw lines between right and wrong, and when it's not clearly laid out for us. We disagree a lot, sometimes we fight, even go to war over conflicting morals. You could argue that it would be easier, even better, if morality was laid out for us by an omniscient and just authority. But that doesn't automatically mean that it is, solely because we would like it to be true. Same goes for these ideas of us being advanced primates and coming from goo. We can't just throw that out because we don't like the sound of that. Long story short, there is not sufficient evidence to support an objective morality in the first place, let alone that God is the authority on it. Thank you.
Hey everyone. So, what is revelation? What do we mean when we say revelation? It's the revealing or disclosure of some form of truth or knowledge through communication with a deity or some other supernatural entity or entities. Now, the great Christian philosopher Thomas Aquinas broke revelation into two broad categories. General revelation, which is the revelation of divine providence, of passive knowledge or truth from God, and manifest destiny, divine will, a personal relationship with God, and he said it was apparent in the natural order of creation. The other category is special revelation. So that's theophany, the manifestation or appearance of power from a deity, miracles, the burning bush, Jesus on toast, and prophecy, the most famous example of which is the book of Revelations, the last book of the New Testament, which hasn't yet come true. So, claims of revelation are generally not considered to be evidence by skeptics and atheists. Why not? As someone who does not have faith in the supernatural, my litmus test for evidence for the supernatural and miracles and prophecies and so on are the broad heuristics of the scientific method. The evidence behind the claim must be demonstrable, repeatable, verifiable. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And lastly, the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions or presumptions to be valid is preferable. And these are the exact same standards that I would apply to non-theistic claims. And as Josh has mentioned, it's impossible to tell the difference between there actually being no physical evidence for a deity and that deity merely disguising its existence. Because of that, many claims based on revelation are fundamentally untestable. But some claims of revelation, especially those around miracles and prophecies, are testable. We don't accept the burden of proof for these claims, but if we are serious about the truth, as Josh said, we can't dismiss them out of hand. So I don't have really much time to cover examples of false miracles, but I would agree with Baruch Spinoza's definition that miracles are merely law-like events of the causes of which we are currently ignorant. There are notable failed biblical prophecies, my favorite being the destruction of Tyre by Nebuchadnezzar. That's Ezekiel 26:7, chapter 7 to 14. Nebuchadnezzar actually withdrew after 13 years of sieging and did not manage to raise the city to the ground. It was destroyed by Alexander the Great about 200 years later, but it still stands today. So, to move on to general revelation. It's a common argument in these sort of debates that personal experience of God is evidence for his existence. But I think this argument can be better rephrased as God is the best explanation. Is God the best explanation for my experience? So that's an inference to the best explanation, and that's something we can assess whether or not it's in fact the best explanation for the experience. So using my previous heuristic criteria for assessing claims of revelation, giving theists the benefit of the doubt, assuming they're being truthful, how do we confirm that the experience is genuine? Is there a test we can perform? Is there a reliable, non-divine authority that we can appeal to? Well, I don't believe so. I don't think there's a way to verify the experience is genuine. And can we even draw a real distinction between this subjective emotion and your garden variety of mystical feeling? Can we separate it from mental illness or a bad trip or a fever dream? So feelings are not empirical. An appeal from subjective personal experience is not sufficient. It's unable to be examined, tested, or felt, even perhaps understood by the other party. And therefore it's not convincing to a non-believer. So, since we have time, I have a little thought experiment that sums up this argument. So it may be argued that it's impossible to verify the truthfulness of any divine revelation, even if such thing exists. So presume that it is possible that omnipotent beings exist and can send messages in the form of revelations. Presume that a person receives what appears to be a message from God, a burning bush, a divine dream. So without verifying the content of the message, it's impossible to know whether or not the message has actually come from God or another being with equivalent reality-controlling abilities, or you could even be hooked up to the Matrix, as long as reality is uncertain. The Christian religion claims there are at least two such beings, God and Satan, of course. So there's the problem of authenticity. It's impossible to verify whether or not the revelation is in fact from God. And therefore, even pre-revealed standards, such as the Bible, suffer the same problem of authenticity. The line of regress doesn't terminate with God. So, in conclusion, the existence of miracles remains unproven. There are few examples of actually fulfilled biblical prophecy. And it would appear to be impossible, even accepting the possibility of divine revelation, to verify whether or not a revelation is in fact from God. And so we find that the claims of revelation are therefore unbelievable and the evidence insufficient for at least a non-believer to accept. Thanks very much.
Well, first I'd like to thank my opposition for making a significant chunk of my case for me. I'm not going to bore you by repeating again definitions of general revelation and special revelation. Instead, I'm just going to jump straight to the chase. At this point in the debate, we're moving away from a general claim that there is a God. We're stepping towards what the four of us happen to believe, that the Christian God exists. It's a much more specific claim, and I'm going to pin it down to one single fact. You see, Christianity isn't just the story of a man who went into a cave, heard some voices and came out and wrote it down. It's not the story of some message from heaven or some burning in your heart that tells you that it's true. It's the story of a very particular revelation in the form of a single person, in the form of a single person who's claimed to exist in history, lived on earth, died, and then come back to life. Now that is a pretty extraordinary claim, and I wouldn't expect any of you to believe it just straight off the bat. If someone comes to you and says, oh, by the way, my brother just came back from the dead, your first response isn't going to be, that's cool, let's go see him. It is true that it's a difficult claim to believe. It takes a little bit of effort. But the test to go with isn't the test that's been proposed. When we're dealing with history, when we're dealing with historical claims, we don't ask whether or not, the invasion of Poland by Germany is demonstrable, repeatable, and verifiable. We ask what evidence exists and what does that evidence back up. Briefly, I want to revisit a point that's come up a couple of times now, which is this question of whether extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. You see, while this is immediately a tempting idea, to assume that because the claim is unusual, you need to require a higher burden,
This means that there are some things which are in fact unprovable. To hold this view is to say that in some circumstances, even if you can show me all the evidence that you would expect to occur if this claim was true, because that doesn't meet the threshold that I'm setting, I'll never believe you. So the question we should ask then is, if there was someone who lived 2,000 years ago, who died and came back to life, what kind of evidence would we expect? Or on the other hand, if this claim was made falsely, what would we expect to see instead? You see, this isn't a new claim. This isn't something that was made up hundreds of years after it happened. We know now that within 30 years after Jesus lived, people were running around Nazareth specifically claiming that he'd come back to life. And instead of simply going and saying, hey guys, here's the tomb, the accusations were all, you must have stolen the body. There must be some other explanation. So what I want to give you now is a case as to whether or not you should believe that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead, because that's the centre of the Christian message. That's basically everything we rely on. In fact, the Apostle Paul said that if that's not true, Christianity is completely worthless. So this is really the point that we're standing by. So let's presume for a moment that it's false. Jesus died, maybe his disciples stole the body, and then for the next 30, 50 years, those people went around being beaten up and killed, claiming that he was still alive. I don't know about you, but personally, at some point, when I'm staring down a death sentence, I'm probably going to go, actually, I've changed my mind, I'm willing to admit the whole thing. But instead, over and over again, we see this didn't happen. And it wasn't just second-hand people. It wasn't just people saying, oh, someone told me that he came back to life, and I believe it. It was people saying, he came back to life, I was there, I saw it, and I'm willing to die defending it. If you want to say that that's untrue, what you've got to go to is they were crazy, they were lying, one of these explanations. Those explanations become increasingly unattractive. Let's start with they're all crazy. So we're talking about up to 500 people all having exactly the same hallucination, running around talking about it and then being willing to die for it. My experience of mental illness, having a couple of people in my family who do see things from time to time that don't exist, is that when they do, they're generally the only ones who get to see it. There aren't any examples in history of 500 people getting together, having exactly the same hallucination and going home to talk about it. That by itself is pretty unusual. You want to flip to the other side? Maybe they were making it up. Again, do you really believe that all those people are going to go to their deaths claiming something they know to be false? So what you have to do is choose between some potentially unattractive propositions. You have to choose to believe that they were liars who just weren't very good at making good decisions. You have to believe that they were nuts and that 500 of them all came to the same conclusion wrongly. Or, if you accept that maybe there is a God, that maybe these things do happen, you've got open to you the option that they were perhaps telling the truth. And that's why they believed it so strongly, because they had seen and felt and touched the person that they were talking about. That's the Christian claim, that Jesus died, came back to life, and that he matters today. And that's the claim that we've been defending all this time.